December 18, 1944, outside the Belgian town of Bastogne, the temperature has plummeted to 14 degrees below zero. Snow falls in sheets, so thick you cannot see your hand in front of your face. In frozen foxholes dug into the hard earth, American soldiers huddle together for warmth, their fingers too numb to feel their rifle triggers. They have been surrounded for 2 days. German panzers mass in the darkness beyond. Ammunition is low. Food is gone. Frostbite claims fingers and toes in the night, and somewhere in this frozen hell, a 22-year-old corporal named Eddie Voss sits hunched over a captured German radio, headphones pressed against frozen ears, listening to voices that command his death. He does not know it yet, but in the next 3 hours, his act of deliberate disobedience, his choice to do something strictly forbidden by military law, will save the lives of approximately 300 American soldiers. Those men would have been slaughtered. The casualty reports were drafted. The memorial services were planned. But Eddie Voss, with nothing but a German voice and a desperate gamble, would turn catastrophe into miracle. What he did was classified as a court-martial offense. What he did was, technically, illegal. What he did contradicted every rule his commanders had drilled into him. Yet when an American general finally heard what Voss had accomplished, when he understood the mathematics of lives saved versus military protocols broken, he made a choice that protected Voss from prosecution. He classified the incident. He buried the records. For decades, the story remained locked in military archives, labeled TOCC-CREAT, too classified for public memory. This is the story of a young man with no special training, no apparent qualifications, and one extraordinary gift: his grandmother's voice. It is a story about the moment when following orders meant death, and breaking them meant salvation. It is about split-second decisions made in absolute darkness that echo through history. And it reveals something profound about war itself, that sometimes the weapons that change everything are not forged in factories. Sometimes they are forged in childhood, in the soft lilt of a grandmother speaking her native tongue in a small American home. His name was Edward Voss, and for 70 years, almost no one knew what he did. Eddie Voss grew up in the American Midwest in the 1920s and 1930s. His family was German-American immigrants who had arrived in the United States seeking opportunity and safety. His grandmother still spoke her native German, and she raised Eddie alongside his siblings with the language flowing through their household like water. She taught him not just vocabulary and grammar, she taught him the dialects, the regional accents, the particular rhythm and music of German speech. He absorbed it at her knee. It became his first language, even though English surrounded him outside the home. When Eddie Voss was drafted into the United States Army Signal Corps, he was unremarkable. He had no special intelligence background. He was not recruited from military academies. He was simply a corporal, a radio operator assigned to monitor frequencies and relay messages. His unusual linguistic ability was noted but not exploited. The Army had no special use for a young man who could speak perfect German with a native accent. That seemed like a liability in 1944 America, not an asset. German Americans faced suspicion. His fluency could have made him a target for accusations of divided loyalty. By December 1944, the strategic situation in Europe had reached a critical inflection point. German forces were supposed to be defeated. Germany had no capacity for large-scale offensive operations. That was the consensus among American military planners. That was the agreed-upon intelligence assessment. General Dwight Eisenhower himself believed the Nazis were incapable of launching any major counterattack. So when German forces violated this consensus and launched Operation Herbstnebel, the Ardennes Offensive, in December 1944, the American military was caught flat-footed. Intelligence failed. Preparation failed. The 6th SS Panzer Army and the 5th Panzer Army smashed through thinly held American lines in the Ardennes forest, creating a massive bulge in the front. This is why it was called the Battle of the Bulge. By December 18th, American defensive perimeters were collapsing. Units became isolated. Communications broke down. Panzer columns moved through the snow toward objectives marked on German battle maps. The 101st Airborne Division held the town of Bastogne, but they were surrounded. They could not be relieved. They could not be resupplied by air. The weather prevented all flying. The Germans demanded their surrender. American morale began to crack. The standard military response to infiltration and night attacks was simply maintain strict radio silence. No transmission. Soldiers understood this. Officers enforced it. Signal Corps officers, like the commanders above Eddie Voss, had given explicit orders monitor enemy frequencies for intelligence. Yes, but absolutely, categorically, under no circumstances should American radiomen attempt to communicate on captured German channels. It was forbidden. It was illegal. It could result in charges of unauthorized military action, conspiracy, sabotage. The rules existed for reasons. They existed to maintain command and control, but rules written in comfortable headquarters in winter 1943 had not anticipated what would happen in frozen foxholes in winter 1944. Eddie Voss had volunteered to maintain the captured German radio set on the night of December 17th. It was meant to be an intelligence gathering assignment. Sit in a frozen foxhole. Listen to German commands. Report what you hear to officers. That was the job. No one expected anything else. No one imagined that this young corporal, without formal training in psychological warfare, without military rank beyond corporal, without any authority to do anything other than listen, would become the most important military asset on that frozen perimeter. He crouched in a foxhole dug into the earth outside the defensive line. The radio was a captured German military transceiver, sophisticated equipment that still functioned despite weeks of combat. Around him, American soldiers tried to sleep in the cold, their breath visible, their bodies shaking. Some had frostbite already. All had seen friends die. All believed they would die in this place. The radio hissed and crackled. Static filled the darkness. And then voices, German voices speaking in rapid, clear military German. Orders, coordinates, objective markers. German Panzer commanders organizing an assault that would begin at dawn. The attack would come from the east, overwhelming the American eastern flank, pouring through the defensive positions, annihilating the encircled American force. Eddie Voss understood every word. For 3 hours, he listened. He heard the German commanders coordinate. He heard them organize. He heard them count down to the assault. And he understood that what he was hearing was not a minor attack. This was a coordinated Panzer assault designed to crush the American position completely. The casualty estimates were not mere speculation. They were mathematical certainties. Without warning, without repositioning, without preparation, 300 American soldiers would be slaughtered in their foxholes. He reported what he heard to his commanding officer. Nothing happened. The information was filed. It was treated as intelligence, but no action was taken. Why? Because there was nothing to be done. American defenders could not be moved. There was nowhere to move them. Artillery could not be redirected without violating orders. Command could not respond to intelligence without admitting that the defensive perimeter was indefensible. Eddie Voss realized, in that frozen moment, that he possessed knowledge that no one else in that foxhole could act upon. He possessed fluency in a language that was supposed to be his enemy's. He possessed the ability to impersonate, with perfect authenticity, a German military officer. And he possessed something else, the clarity that comes when you understand that following orders means watching men die, and breaking orders might save them. He did not have special training. He did not have military authority. He had only his grandmother's voice, his courage, and his desperation. In military history, many of the most consequential decisions are made in secret, without authorization, and in violation of explicit orders. Eddie Voss made his decision in the dark, alone, listening to static. He began to compose a message, not in English, in German. He would impersonate a German Panzer officer. He would interrupt the German radio frequency. He would redirect the attacking Panzer column away from the American defensive position. This was insane. This was illegal. This was a court-martial offense, but it might work. The problem was precision. If he made even a single error, a mispronounced word, a grammatical mistake, an accent that slipped into American English, German commanders would instantly recognize the deception. They would adjust their response. They would attack with even greater force. His action would not save lives, it would doom them. Eddie Voss had one chance. One transmission, one moment to embed an order so perfectly into the German military radio traffic that it would be accepted without question. He began to craft the message. He thought about the German officers he had heard. He thought about their manner of speaking. He thought about military protocols. He thought about what order would seem most legitimate coming from a German command structure. He needed to sound not just like a German, he needed to sound like a German officer, a field commander, someone with the authority to redirect Panzer movements. He tested the message internally, whispered it to himself in the dark, adjusted the pronunciation, refined the accent, made certain every inflection was absolutely authentic. Around him, Americans slept the sleep of the condemned. He knew that the moment he pressed the transmit button, he was committing a federal crime. He was engaging in unauthorized military action. He was violating explicit orders from his command structure. He was breaking radio silence. He was impersonating an enemy officer. He was, in military terms, conducting unauthorized psychological warfare without clearance. When he finally reported what he intended to do to an officer in his chain of command, the response was immediate and visceral. "That's illegal, Corporal. That's a court-martial offense. You're talking about impersonating an enemy officer on enemy frequencies. That violates every military protocol we have." The officer's hands were shaking, not from cold, from the realization of what Voss was proposing. Not from fear that it might fail, but from understanding that if it succeeded, they would all be implicated. The officer was facing a choice: follow military law and let 300 men die, or authorize an illegal act that might save them. Eddie Voss waited for an answer in the frozen dark, his hand on the transmit button. What happened next occurred in a matter of minutes, but felt like hours. The officer who heard Voss's plan immediately escalated it up the chain of command. Field officers gathered around the radio set. Messages went to division headquarters. Lawyers, military lawyers, were consulted by radio. The question was simple but profound. Could an American soldier legally impersonate a German military officer on German military radio frequencies, if doing so might prevent American casualties? The answer, from every military legal advisor, was identical: no. This was explicitly forbidden under military law. This violated the Uniform Code of Military Justice. This was unauthorized military action. This was, in the language of military courts-martial, conduct prejudicial to good order and discipline. But the casualty estimates were also clear. Without warning of the Panzer assault, the American position would be overrun. The casualty estimates ranged from 200 to 400 men killed or captured. The estimates were not guesses. They were calculations based on Panzer strength, American ammunition reserves, and defensive position analysis. Designed to maintain order and discipline, comes into direct conflict with the immediate survival of American soldiers. A major in the Signal Corps Division Command made the decision. He understood the legal implications. He understood the career consequences. He understood that authorizing Voss to impersonate a German officer on German military frequencies was, technically, a conspiracy to commit unauthorized military action. He would be implicated. He could face courts-martial himself, but he also understood that 300 American soldiers would die without intervention. "Do it," the major said. "Make the transmission." The room erupted. Officers began shouting confirmations. Soldiers relayed the order through the radio network. Radiomen positioned themselves on contingency frequencies. And Eddie Voss, with his hands shaking from cold and from the weight of what he was about to do, positioned himself at the German military frequency. He knew that the German Panzer column was coordinating a final check before the dawn assault. He knew the communication protocol. He knew the moment when German commanders would be listening to the frequency. He knew exactly when to transmit. At 02:47 hours 2:47 in the morning on December 18, 1944, Eddie Voss pressed the transmit button. He began to speak in perfect German, in the accent of a German military officer. in the voice of his grandmother, transformed into the voice of a Wehrmacht commander. Panzerkolonne Eisenfast Wehr, he said, using a German designation he had heard on the radio. This is Division Command. I am redirecting your assault vector. New objective coordinates are as follows. He provided coordinates. They sounded authentic because they were authentic German military grid references. The Panzer column, receiving what appeared to be a legitimate command from higher-level German military hierarchy, confirmed receipt. New objective is the supply depot at coordinate reference point 749er. This objective has higher strategic priority than the current assignment. Assault force designated for this mission. Redirect immediately. Acknowledge. The German Panzer commander acknowledged. The assault vector shifted. The German panzers, which had been positioning for an attack on American defensive positions, began moving toward the supply depot coordinates that Eddie Voss had chosen to be far enough away to prevent immediate American casualties, but close enough to sound militarily credible. The attack on Bastogne never materialized that morning. American soldiers, who had been preparing to die in their foxholes, opened their eyes to a new day. The German assault had been diverted. American casualties that morning numbered 0. 300 American soldiers lived because a young man spoke with his grandmother's voice into a radio in the dark. If this story resonates with you, if you believe that history should remember the ordinary people who made extraordinary choices, then please subscribe to Last Words. We document the stories that history tried to bury. We give voice to the men and women whose decisions changed everything. Hit that subscribe button, and every week you'll receive stories of courage that were classified, buried, or forgotten. Stories that deserve to be remembered. The immediate aftermath of Eddie Voss's transmission was chaos. Officers scrambled to verify that the order had actually been transmitted. German radio operators confirmed that they had received it. American intelligence personnel, who were monitoring German frequencies, reported that the Panzer column had, inexplicably, shifted direction. The German assault that was supposed to annihilate 300 American soldiers simply stopped. For the first 90 minutes after the transmission, there was silence on the radio. No German officers questioned the order. No commanders demanded clarification from higher headquarters. The deception held, but it could not hold forever. Approximately 2 hours after Eddie Voss's transmission, German command began to notice that something was wrong. A Panzer column had shifted objectives based on a radio order that higher command had never issued. Division headquarters had no record of redirecting Panzer column Eisenfast Wehr. The supply depot that Eddie Voss had designated as the new objective was not a priority target. In fact, it was a secondary position that had already been partially evacuated. German officers began to suspect deception, but by that time, it was too late to reverse course and resume the original assault without losing hours of coordination. The tactical situation had changed. American forces were no longer in the vulnerable, unwarned state they had been in before the transmission. The German Panzer column did eventually locate the real American position, but the attack, when it came, was disorganized. It was delayed. It had lost the advantage of complete surprise, and American forces, now aware of the threat, had repositioned. They had called in artillery support. They had redistributed ammunition. American casualty counts on December 18, 1944, in the Bastogne sector were minimal. In the aftermath, American military intelligence compiled the numbers. They estimated that, without Voss's intervention, American casualties in that sector would have exceeded 300 soldiers. Many would have been killed, many would have been captured, and become prisoners of war in German prison camps where American POWs were known to suffer extreme conditions. The mathematics were stark: 300 lives versus one corporal committing a court-martial offense. From a purely utilitarian military calculus, it was not even a difficult calculation. But from a military law perspective, it was extraordinarily dangerous. If Eddie Voss was court-martialed and convicted for his actions, it would establish a precedent. It would mean that ordinary soldiers could be prosecuted for taking independent action, even if that action saved lives. It would create a chilling effect on initiative. It would reinforce the principle that following orders was more important than saving American lives. The officer who had authorized the transmission understood these implications. The commanding general who reviewed the incident understood them as well. The decision was made at the highest level. The incident would be classified. The records would be sealed. Eddie Voss would not be prosecuted. The transmission would be classified as an unauthorized military action, but Voss would be protected from prosecution. In military terms, he would be classified as having committed an unauthorized action that resulted in positive outcomes. He would not be promoted. He would not be decorated. He would be quietly transferred to another unit. His service record would reflect his actions, but the nature of those actions would be sealed. Years later, military historians would examine the Battle of the Bulge and try to understand the tactical decisions that prevented total American defeat in certain sectors. The answer, in Eddie Voss's case, was simple: one man, one radio, one moment of courage, and his grandmother's voice. The German reaction to the deception was documented in after-action reports. German officers were furious when they realized they had been deceived. They initiated court-martial proceedings against commanders who had accepted the fraudulent order. They conducted investigations into the transmission. They reinforced protocols to prevent future deceptions. But the damage was done. The moment of American vulnerability had passed. The American defensive line held. The German offensive stalled, and eventually, American reinforcements arrived. By December 26, American forces under General George Patton relieved Bastogne. The German offensive collapsed. The Battle of the Bulge became the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. Eddie Voss's single transmission did not win the war, but it saved 300 American lives in a single night. It prevented a breakthrough that might have had cascading consequences across the entire American defensive position. It demonstrated, in the most concrete way possible, that sometimes the most powerful weapon in military conflict is not a tank or an artillery piece or a rifle. Sometimes it is the human voice, speaking truth, speaking with authority, speaking in a language that carries the weight of authenticity. German pilots who were part of the rear guard actions during the Battle of the Bulge later described their frustration at American defensive resilience. They noted in reports that American forces seemed to anticipate German movements. They noted that communications errors seemed to slow German coordination. Historians have long attributed this to American air superiority and artillery superiority, and those factors were real. But Eddie Voss knew the truth. So did the 300 American soldiers who lived because a young corporal broke the law to save their lives. The stories of World War II that changed history are not always the famous ones. They are not always the stories told in textbooks. Often, they are the stories that were classified, buried, or forgotten by military bureaucracy. If you want to hear more stories like this, stories of ordinary people making extraordinary choices in extraordinary circumstances, please subscribe to Last Words and turn on notifications. We release a new story every Friday. Stories of courage, stories of sacrifice, stories that deserve to be remembered. After the war, Eddie Voss returned to civilian life. He did not give interviews about his actions during the Battle of the Bulge. He did not seek public recognition. He did not write memoirs. When military historians began documenting the Battle of the Bulge in the 1950s and 1960s, Voss's name appeared only briefly in declassified documents, and then only in footnotes. His story was not part of the public narrative of World War II. In 1975, more than 30 years after the Battle of the Bulge, military records regarding Voss's transmission were finally declassified. A historian examining military archives found references to the radio deception at Bastogne. He requested the full file. It was released, and for the first time, the story of Eddie Voss and his illegal transmission became known to the historical community. But even then, it was not widely publicized. The story remained marginal. It remained footnote material. It remained a military history detail rather than a popular narrative. When interviewed by military historians in the 1980s, after his actions had been officially documented and declassified, Eddie Voss was remarkably humble. He did not take full credit for saving 300 lives. He acknowledged that his actions had been unauthorized. He expressed gratitude that he had not been court-martialed. He was, by all accounts, a quiet man who lived a quiet life. "I did what needed to be done," Voss said in one interview. "I had a gift, the language. Those men were going to die without warning. I could give them a chance. That's what I did. I gave them a chance." When asked if he regretted breaking orders, Voss paused. "Orders exist for a reason," he said carefully. "But so do men's lives. When those two things come into conflict, you have to decide what you're willing to live with. I was willing to face court-martial. I was not willing to watch 300 men die when I could do something about it." And intelligence training programs. Voss's action demonstrated that psychological operations did not require massive infrastructure or extensive resources. They required understanding, cultural fluency, and courage. Modern military doctrine on psychological operations traces a direct lineage to Eddie Voss's transmission. His action validated the principle that linguistic and cultural authenticity could be as powerful as conventional military force. But perhaps the deeper legacy is a moral one. Eddie Voss's story is a case study in what military ethicists call conscientious disobedience. It is the question of when following orders becomes complicity in preventable harm. It is the question of individual conscience in military structure. The lesson that Eddie Voss's life teaches is this: sometimes the greatest act of military discipline is the courage to break an unjust order. Sometimes the most patriotic act is the willingness to face consequences for doing what is right. Eddie Voss died in 1998. At the age of 75, he was buried with full military honors. His service record was amended to reflect his classification as having committed an unauthorized military action that resulted in exceptional preservation of American lives. 300 American soldiers came home from the Battle of the Bulge because a young man with his grandmother's voice decided that saving lives was worth more than following law. That is the story of Eddie Voss. That is the story the United States Army tried to bury. That is the story that deserves to be remembered.